The North is suffering.
Their ascent into space was a violation of the will of Sajuuk. The North will know us now, no longer as brothers, but by counting the number of their dead.
Kharak, a barely habitable world on the utmost fringes of the galaxy. Most of the planet's surface consisted only of desert, with only the northern and southern poles livable for the sole species that called this world home, the Kharakid. Kharak was an ancient planet, estimated to be over 6.7 billion years old, and as such the reason for its vast deserts were simple: the world was dying. Sometime between 1068 KDS and 1110 KDS, Kharakian dating system, scan data from Kharakid environmental monitoring satellites confirmed the deserts of the planet were growing larger and encroaching on the last life-supporting regions of the planet. One scientist from Kiith Gaalsien even estimated that given the rate of desertification, Kharak would be completely inhospitable to the Kharakid people in less than 350 years, at best. Knowledge of this apocalyptic discovery was quietly hidden from the general public by the ruling Kiith Sa leaders of the Great Diamond, but it was only a matter of time before they would realize the truth of their situation. The burgeoning Kharakid space program was the closest to providing anything that resembled a solution. Their first space launches discovered a curious debris ring in orbit that appeared to consist of the wreckage of several spaceships of non-Kharakid design. From 1061 KDS up until around 1110 KDS, this wreckage would be brought down and analyzed by Kharakid scientists. While these discoveries would increase their technology and science by leaps and bounds, the most coveted prize always evaded the Kharakid, a completely intact vessel. Ever hopeful to find this holy grail, Kiith Gaalsien developed a new sensor system called the Vin Cal, a series of deep scan radar satellites able to detect objects within hundreds of millions of kilometers around Kharak's orbit. But years of few to no contacts forced the project to shrink substantially. All of that was to change, however, by 1106. A Vin Cal satellite's maneuvering thrusters had malfunctioned and was tumbling into low orbit. A young technician named Lakab Garaaki attempted to bring the satellite under control but to no avail, and he was forced to initiate the self-destruct command. Obligated by his duties to review the Vin Cal's scans before he signed out for the day, Garaaki made a startling discovery. As the satellite was in freefall, it continued to commence its high-power radar scans on Kharak's equatorial region, penetrating deep beneath its sands. What it found was something huge and made of metal, with an energy signature that rivaled that of Kharak's sun. Initially termed the Garaaki object, but later officially designated the primary anomaly, it appeared that the Holy Grail Kharakid scientists were searching for was not in the depths of space, but was much closer to home. However, satellite scans could only say so much, and the Diamond Security Council quickly launched Operation Skull Bree, where a heavy carrier, the Ifrit Nabal, was outfitted for a long-haul expedition to the Garaaki object. However, 1 month into their expedition, the carrier mysteriously disappeared and all contact was lost. Several arguments went back and forth in the Diamond as to the fate of the Ifrit Nabal, but the lesson learned was clear. The deserts of Kharak were not to be underestimated. The Northern Coalition would have to temper their impatience with caution and preparation. Despite the terrible loss, a second expedition was almost guaranteed, and when that time would come, the Kharakid would do it right. By 1110, Operation Kadim, the name of the second expedition, was preparing to launch. An entirely redesigned carrier was purpose-built to withstand the perils of the Great Banded Desert, the Sakala class. 5 of these carriers would embark on the journey to the primary anomaly, with the carrier Kapizi crewed by members of Kiith Gaalsien leading the effort. Morale was high, and the command staff was confident that they were now well and truly prepared to unlock the mystery of the Garaaki object. But the harsh desert contained more than just sand and searing heat. Kiith Gaalsien, an exiled group of religious zealots, believed that the Kharakid people were created by the great maker Sajuuk to suffer, and only by the strictest adherence to his commandments would they find favor with him. The strength of their convictions were so strong that the centuries-long heresy wars was caused solely because Kiith Sidiim, major leaders of the Kharakid at the time, believed that their existence on Kharak was due to some unknown sin that affronted the gods, whereas the Gaalsiens believed that such an idea was arrogance and a grievous affront to Sajuuk. After the end of the Heresy Wars, the power of Kiith Gaalsien shrunk to only a fraction of their original size, with only the great temple city of Sajuuk under their control. In a final act of defiance, the Gaalsien Kiith Sa destroyed the infrastructure keeping the desert sands from enveloping the city, thus causing Sajuuk to be buried. When news of this reached the other Kiithid, the Diamid at the time banished the Gaalsiens and declared them to be outlaws, but they had since slipped away into the desert, avoiding retribution. However, starting from sometime in or around the 1070s, the Gaalsiens began attacking the northern Kiithid as they began work on Project Stormbreaker, a massive construction effort to build sand baffle walls to keep the deserts from encroaching on the temperate lands of the north. The Gaalsiens saw this construction effort as opposing Sajuuk's will. It began with religious posters plastered over construction sites and publicly broadcasted prayer sermons. Eventually, these non-violent acts gave way to the Gaalsiens declaring an outright holy war against the Kiithid of the Northern Coalition. This conflict would reach its peak during an operation by the Gaalsien Sa named the Sifar Korshesh, the Night of Fiery Daggers. In 1074, 10,000 Gaalsiens hit the main entrance of the Stormbreaker Wall, slaughtering the Sidiim defenders, Sajet technicians, and Haral laborers, who died to the last man and woman defending their posts. As bloody as this was only the opening stage of the Nabal Saw's plan to crush these zealots. Once the Gaalsiens brought in their reserves to push beyond the breach they made, Sobani mercenaries literally came out from the desert floor behind them. Caught between the warriors of Kiith Soban and the Stormbreaker Wall, they were victorious in the ensuing conflict, and the Gaalsien military would be forced to cease any actions on the Northern Coalition for over a generation. However, a state of war still existed between the two groups by the time of the Capizi's launch in 1110 KDS. The Gaalsiens had returned in overwhelming force, and had the Stormbreaker walls under siege for several months. As a matter of fact, the launch date of the expedition was accelerated by 3 months, to give the defenders on the northern wall a temporary respite to rebuild and rearm, as the Gaalsiens could not ignore any foray into their deserts. The timing was impeccable. Just as the Capizi was undergoing final checks prior to launch, Gaalsien forces had launched a coordinated offensive that was on the verge of breaking through the Stormbreaker defenses. By the time the Capizi reached the final base for last-minute desert refits, the northern capital of Tyr itself was under attack. Only one other carrier from the expedition was able to launch in time, the Sakala, crewed by members of Kiith Sidiim. Failure was no longer an option. If Operation Kadim did not succeed, the free peoples of the north would be forced to capitulate to the Gaalsiens, and eventually the extinction of their race would be guaranteed as the growing deserts would bury the Kharakid in their entirety. The first step of the operation was to reunite with the Sakala, which was still behind the Capizi. Both carriers would rally at a location known simply as Hell's Gate. From there, they would proceed together to the primary Anomaly, while attempting to avoid the core of Gaalsien territory in the worst of the desert heat along the way. As the Capizi arrived at Hell's Gate ahead of the Sakala, the Sajet fleet stumbled upon the wreckage of the Ifrit Nabal, partially buried under the sand and rendered immobile due to Dune collapse. Rachel Sajet, chief scientist of the Capizi's crew, eagerly began analyzing the wreckage to determine what happened to the ship and her crew, as her brother Jacob was the Ifrit Nabal's first officer. What she and the science team found aboard the Nabal was a strange artifact of unknown design that was hooked into their sensor systems, which, when adapted to the systems of the Capizi, boosted sensor efficiency to an unprecedented level. Also found on their computers was a message from Jacob detailing the fate of the carrier, and that more such alien artifacts could be found at a location they deemed the Kalash Site. But by now, Gaalsien reinforcements had begun to home in on their position while they were determining the fate of their comrades. Making a decision, Captain Roman Sajet ordered an escape at best speed to this Kalash Site. If just one of those artifacts could boost their sensors as much as it did, then there was no telling what else could be found there. The Sakala would be notified of the change of plans once the Capizi evaded the Gaalsiens. Entering the Kalash Site, what they found was something no one could have anticipated: the wreckage of a starship. Further scans of the area revealed that this site was rich in technological artifacts both on the surface and buried underground by the sand. The Gaalsiens had obviously been harvesting these wrecks, and analyzing the technology within to both bolster their military and give themselves a technological edge. For example, Coalition forces still use treads and wheels to move about the desert terrain, whereas the Gaalsien fleets made prolific use of anti-gravity propulsion for their vehicles. Coalition satellite scans in the past had detected many such sites since the discovery of the Garaaki object. If the Gaalsiens were able to leverage these wrecks to become a serious and effective threat against the Kiith of the North, then the Capizi's crew could do the same against the renegade Kiith. As such, the Capizi command staff realized that this was a priceless opportunity, and came to the decision that they would salvage as much as they could from the Kalash Site to give them a better chance at fighting the Gaalsiens before moving on. Unfortunately, their ship-breaking efforts drew the notice and ire of a Gaalsien carrier, the Ashoka. Beset on all sides by fanatical zealots, the Capizi crews retreated back to the alien shipwreck to concentrate their forces and give them the best possible chance at defense. However, the Gaalsiens were relentless, and the threat of the Capizi's position being overrun grew with every minute. But as if guided by the Hand of Sajuuk himself, the Gaalsien forces unexpectedly erupted in a series of violent explosions. But this was not divine intervention, but the work of Sidiim bombers from the Sakala which had recently arrived on station, saving their beleaguered comrades from their expected fate. Now, with the odds reversed, the two carriers forced the Ashoka into retreating. Knowing that the Gaalsien carrier would not leave them be, both coalition fleets chose to pursue the Ashoka into the Belladin Dune Sea. While she was initially able to outpace the carriers, eventually the damage the Ashoka took from the previous battle forced her to pull over for repairs and resource harvesting, making them vulnerable. The expedition captains would make keen use of this opportunity. Both would split up, with the Sakala engaging from the north. Once the Ashoka would also move north to engage, the Capizi would come from the south, destroy their resourcing operation, then flank the Gaalsien carrier from behind. But the old military axiom of no plan surviving first contact with the enemy proved true. As the Capizi began attacking the Gaalsien resource site, the Ashoka broke off her fight with the Sakala to return. Again, due to the Ashoka's advanced technology, the Gaalsien carrier was easily able to outrun her Sidiim counterpart, so that by the time the Ashoka began to engage the Capizi, the Sakala would arrive too late to help. Determined to finally put an end to this annoying carrier, Captain Sajet of the Capizi ordered his forces to engage the Ashoka in one final showdown. Using cunning tactics and dogged perseverance, the Ashoka inevitably fell before the repeated bombardments and continual attacks by the Capizi fleet. By the time the Sakala reached them, all that was left to do was pick through the wreckage. Now, it was finally time to move on to the primary anomaly, but there was just one more obstacle in the way: a Gaalsien base located at the edge of the Dune Sea. Both expedition carriers would follow the same plan of attack as with the Ashoka. The Sakala would attack from the north, drawing off the base's defenders, while the Capizi would again come in from the south and destroy the base. This time, however, the plan worked. The Gaalsiens left defending the base were quickly outmaneuvered and outpowered by the Capizi fleet. Upon reaching the main facility, Rachel was sent in to download the Gaalsien database, as it was believed that since the Gaalsiens had been harvesting the shipwrecks for far longer than the northern Kiith, the chances of finding something that would benefit the expedition were high, and if the Capizi was lucky, they could find more information about the Garaaki object. But downloading such a large database would take time. Unfortunately, history chose this specific point to repeat itself. When the Gaalsiens were notified of the Capizi's assault on their base, they turned away from the Sakala to return and defend their secrets. Of course, that wasn't all. The Gaalsien base crew set their fuel source to explode in an indeterminate amount of time. Even if the Capizi fleet could hold off the incoming Gaalsiens, there was no guarantee that they could fully extract the database, or escape with their lives. However, either luck, or the will of Sajuuk, or most likely both, was on the side of the Sajet that day. The Capizi forces managed to hold off the Gaalsiens long enough to get their database, and escape with their lives with mere seconds to spare as the base exploded around them. The risk appeared to have been worth it, as a clearer picture of the Gaalsien's motivations began to coalesce. The current War of the North was based on their supreme leader, the Hand of Sajuuk's, assertion that the Kiith of the Northern Coalition would undoubtedly bring down the fires of Sajuuk onto Kharak. This was primarily due to the Coalition's forays into space, as their scripture, or their interpretation of scripture, forbade any kind of space travel. As the Northern Kiith continued on with their attempts to reach the stars, the Hand of Sajuuk saw no choice but to declare war in order to stop their efforts, as in their view, if the Coalition space program continued, the North would eventually bring Armageddon down on all Kharakid, faithful and heretic alike. Another interesting point found in the database was that the Gaalsiens placed a great importance in the myths of Khar-Toba, the first city of the Kharakid where the great maker Sajuuk first placed his people on Kharak. Khar-Toba was important to the Gaalsiens, as they believed the Hand of Sajuuk would become the instrument of God's will and ascend to rule over all of Kharak once he entered the temple at Khar-Toba. However, much like the northern Kiithid, its location had long since been lost to them. Regardless of how much the Gaalsien prophecy was based in fact and reality, the expedition had to press on. As the Kiith was entering an area known as the Garaaki Highlands to reach their goal, they had stumbled upon another Gaalsien dig site harvesting downed ships. At this stage in the expedition's journey, finding more crashed spaceships would not have been a cause for alarm. However, what was particularly remarkable about this dig site in particular was that, 1. Most of the ships at the site were fully intact, or in stages of disassembly by the Gaalsiens, and 2. The open caverns they rested in were perfectly smooth, as if the earth and sand simply had opened up and placed these ships inside. While the Kiith could not delay long at the site, what the science team found from their quick survey of the shipwrecked fleet allowed for Rachel to develop a theory that she presented to the command staff. Something on the planet was taking ships as they were traveling within a certain proximity to the planet, and then reassembling them underground in the deserts using some kind of artificial quantum waveform. This thing, as it were, was found to be located at the primary anomaly, where the quantum signature of its energy output matched that of the grounded fleet they had just encountered. The implications were stunning, as this meant whatever was at the Garaaki object was even more powerful than the Kiithid scientists predicted, if it was taking interstellar ships and depositing them on the planet. Once again, there was no time for deep reflection on this new development. As the Kiith moved to regroup with the Sakala before entering the Garaaki Highlands, the Sakala sent out a plea for assistance as they had come under attack by 2 Gaalsien carriers. Eventually, while the combined efforts of the Sakala and the Kiith prevailed, and 2 more carriers being added to their kill count, yet another obstacle arose. Due to this unexpected battle, supplies for both carriers were running critically low. Making matters worse, the Gaalsiens had captured Epsilon Base, the facility where the Kiith's journey began. Through Epsilon's own computer databases, the Gaalsiens now knew why 2 Coalition carriers had breached their territory, and from that were able to discover the location of the primary anomaly. With this new information in hand, the Gaalsiens then came to one conclusion, that the anomaly was in actuality Khar-Toba as prophesized, and if the Hand of Sajuuk could reach this site, their ascension to being the right hand of God would be guaranteed. In this dire picture, a brief glimmer of hope arose. While continuing to pore over the data from the Gaalsien Base, Rachel had found a hidden encrypted message from her brother, Jacob Sajet. In the message, he explained that he had been taken captive by the Gaalsiens, and that they had recently unearthed a trigger to some kind of weapon of immense power. While the Gaalsiens did not understand what they had, Jacob did, and he had a plan. He ended his message with the words, "I know you're coming. Be ready." Frustratingly though, nothing could be done about any of these new developments. There was simply no way to get around the supply shortage they were facing. Instead, the Sakala and Kiith chose to focus on their most pressing concern, securing the Khashar Plateau, a natural runway of sorts that would allow for Coalition landing craft to bring in the supplies both ships desperately needed. The Kiith arrived at the Khashar Plateau first, and after a brief but furious battle with the Gaalsien defenders, the Sajet carrier held the plateau. Inevitably, Sidiim landers began their approach, with the Sakala arriving at the same time. Now that the Sakala was in the process of being resupplied, all that was left to do was wait for the Sajet flyers to arrive. In the interim, they bore silent witness to the Hand of Sajuuk's fleet as it was closing in on the primary anomaly by a satellite uplink. But to the shock of the spectators, a beam of light appeared to descend from the sky and annihilate the Gaalsien forces in a massive explosion. Scrambling to identify what just happened, the Kiith's intelligence officer, Nathan Sajet, found that the beam originated from a weapon satellite in orbit, and that it was triggered from a location to the southeast. Realizing this was in all likelihood what her brother told her to be ready for, Rachel quickly left with a combat escort to investigate the site where the signal came from. The twin carriers would stay behind at the Khashar Plateau to await the last landers, When the resupply was finished, the fleets would meet her at the site. But Captain Mashad of the Sakala had a far different idea. As the Sajet aircraft attempted to land on the plateau, they were shot down by Sidiim fighters, destroying one and forcing the other to crash land. The captain then declared his intentions to the Sajet, that only Kiith Sidiim and their Kiith Sa were of divine origin, and only they held any claim to what lay at the primary anomaly. They then sped off into the desert to hunt down Rachel's signal, leaving the Capizzi crew behind in shock. Salvaging what they could from the landers, the Capizzi took off in hot pursuit of the Sakala. Realizing the importance of keeping whatever Rachel discovered away from the Sidiim, Captain Sajet was determined to reach her in time. But the Sakala had far too much of a head start, and the Sidiim were already closing in on Rachel. In a perilously close running battle, she and her group managed to hold off the Sidiim armor and rendezvous with the Capizzi in the west. Once she was safely aboard with her discovery from the crash site, the Capizzi's forces spared no Sidiim in their vengeful fury. With the treacherous carrier dealt with, Rachel revealed what she found at the dig site: the wreckage of a spacefaring carrier, with the only clue to its origins being a single word: Taidan. This space carrier was sent to deploy an orbital satellite weapon for unexplained reasons before it was grounded by the effects of the primary anomaly. What the expedition crews saw when the Gaalsien fleet was destroyed as they were nearing the Garaaki object was this weapon in action. The satellite was triggered by none other than Rachel's brother, Jacob Sajet, using a device stolen from the Gaalsien base he escaped from, used in conjunction with a transponder found at the Taidan carrier. Jacob also knew that by using the trigger at this specific point, his sister and her crew would be able to home in on the signal generated and find both the wreckage and the means to control the weapon's satellite. How he even got to the site was a testament to the strength of his convictions. In an incredible display of sheer willpower, he escaped from Gaalsien captivity, then crossed the long distance from the Gaalsien base to the carrier's resting site. Unfortunately, he died shortly after he activated the satellite, from prolonged exposure to the harsh desert conditions. The Sajet crew would not allow their Kiith brother to die in vain, least of all Rachel. At best possible speed, the Capizzi managed to reach the primary anomaly in good time. What they found, though, was the wreckage of another ship, this time much larger and of different design than the Taidan carrier. Curiously, though, the Gaalsiens had already reached the site. However, they inexplicably held their position just outside the area. But that would undoubtedly change once they realized the Capizzi was at the site. Regardless, the fleet had come too far, and Rachel was sent in to scan and analyze the wreck. What she found was that there was far more to this ship than just what was peeking out from the sands. An entire city was buried underneath them, untouched for countless centuries. This could only mean one thing. They had found Khar-Toba, the first city of the Kharakid, long since lost to the eons of time that it became relegated to myth and legend. But just as expected, the Gaalsien fleets became aware of the Capizzi's presence and were now moving in to attack the fleet. Making matters worse, the leader of the Gaalsiens, the Kalash Site himself, was leading this attack from his personal carrier, the Hand of Sajuuk. Surrounded on all sides by hostile enemies, the Capizzi forces bravely held off the Gaalsien aggressors, but the numbers were simply not on their side. Fortunately, by now, Rachel had unlocked the secrets of the Taidani weapon satellite in orbit and proceeded to use it against their enemies to even the odds. With the tables now turned, the Sajet forces rallied and pushed on to the Hand of Sajuuk. In a climactic showdown between the two land behemoths, the Gaalsien carrier was obliterated. Shaken by the loss of their leader and the dawning realization that their god had forsaken them, the Capizzi fleet managed to eliminate the stragglers and secure the Khar-Toba site. With the Gaalsiens broken, the ruins could now be studied in depth by the Kiithid of the North. The knowledge that could be gained from this site was incalculable and would change the course of history for the Kharakid, but it would take them innumerable years to fully delve into the secrets of the Khar-Toba. However, one thing at this point was certain: the Kharakid truly were not of this world. If the first city was built around a spaceship, then that meant they truly were brought to this planet from across the stars. Right here was real, physical evidence that they were not native to Kharak. Thus, as a people, they could no longer call themselves the Kharakid, as they were not of Kharak. Instead, they would call themselves by a new name, the Kushan. Jacob Sajet once told his sister that salvation lay in the desert. and as events would unfold, he would eventually be proven right. Although it would be many generations before the Kushan people would see that salvation take form.